It was an idyllic setting. The river, the valley, the rugged beauty of the mountains. But imagine leaving everything you know behind to set off for an unknown, distant land. True with the hope of a better future, but also knowing you would never, ever return. This was the reality for my ancestor, Torkel Torkelson. I've always been intrigued by this man with the funny name. He was my great-grandfather. I never met him. He died 50 years before I was born. Yet I've always felt drawn to him. I've been trying to find out more about him for 3 decades. So imagine how I felt when I was offered an opportunity to travel to his birthplace. This was also a way to validate decades of work. All I started with was a note card written by my grandmother, who was married to the son of my Norwegian immigrant. Needless to say, there were many inaccurate spellings on that card. I found Norway to be a lovely country, full of happy and friendly people. I was surprised by how clean everything was and how many tunnels they had. I had been asked to come and make a series of presentations on science and faith to a Christian organization there. But when they found out that I had roots in the country, and where, my friend started asking around, and lo and behold, he found a venue for me not 10 minutes from the Torkelson homestead of Konsmo, or Konsmo in American, a little town in south-central Norway. I was floored. Konsmo is a small village nestled in a long, narrow valley in southern Norway. In one mid-19th century census, the town contained 1,021 persons, living in 191 houses. Konsmo was as picturesque as it was poor. The thin soils in the country of Vest or West Agder made farming unproductive. Worse, subdivision of farmland led to smaller and smaller plots, to the point where the average family could not raise enough food to live on. In fact, Konsmo was a waypoint along an annual migration path for hundreds of children. They called them barnevanderer, the child wanderers. The children, some as young as 9 years old, would walk 100 miles or more to the south and east in the spring, looking for work among the richer farms in Ost or East Agder, and return to their families in the fall. The children were gone from April to November. It must have been heartbreaking. I cannot imagine. Was my great-grandfather among them? How about his siblings, cousins, aunts and uncles, parents? Konsmo was a major hub on the wandering trail. Children from that town in Eiken, Kvas, and Kvinesdal to the north would gather around the church here before setting off. They made a movie about this, Johan Barnevanderer. It has a pretty poor rating, but I still want to see it one day. There's a monument to the Barnevanderer right in the middle of town. It's not a big town. But my family lived in a small town. At least 3 generations were married, baptized, and or buried at this little church in Konsmo. Multiple family members served as witnesses at the numerous marriages and baptisms in the community, which I found online in the Norwegian Digital Arkivet. Just a note for people who want to study their family, it is not hard to read Norwegian. In fact, for the archives, the Digital Arkivet, you have to know maybe a dozen words. So the word for groom, bride, child, born, died. And then you too can start pouring through this because there's still a lot of work to be done here. Notice that all the gravestones in the churchyard are facing toward the east, in the proper old-fashioned Christian tradition, waiting for the second coming of Christ and the resurrection from the east. Torkel Torkelson was born to a blacksmith and a farmer's daughter. His father, also named Torkel, being a blacksmith, was a vital part of the community, while his mother hailed from a place called Solberg. At least, her name in one record was Guri Larsdatter Solberg. The Larsdatter middle name is easy enough. That's her patronym. Her father's name plus the word for daughter, Lars, daughter. I guess Solberg was a farm because many people use such names. I had no idea where it was and had no way of finding out, and Google was drawing a blank. I was driving to Konsmo to have dinner with a man I had never met. His name was Odd. He was the organizer for my evening talk at the Underland Missionjard. Underland means underland, but it's also a family name. The Underland Mission Farm, where I had the privilege of staying overnight, and I was awed by the beauty of that small, rugged farm where some family had managed to scrape out a living over centuries. It was only a 10-minute drive from there to Konsmo, and Ode lives another 10 minutes north, uphill, along a one-lane dirt road. Imagine my shock when he told Ugir, my friend, that Solberg was a farm right next to his. So he called up the owner and he arranged for me to visit. This is not possible. Never in a million years would I have been able to find that farm, but there it was. Sol as in solar, berg as in iceberg. Solberg means sun hill or sun mountain. And there I was, standing in that beautiful, picturesque place where my great-great-grandmother was probably born. Now, I didn't get to meet him, but Ode's father came to my talk that evening. While there, he told my friend that he thought they used to worship the sun on that mountain in pre-Christian days. A funny stone caught my eye when I was there. I wonder. The current owner of the farm, Mr. Talia, showed me the stone walls from the old house. He said the structure had become dangerous, so he took it down in 1995. He also said he had to clear all the fields of trees to make the place into a farm again. We then had to treat a plant called sira, the Norwegian word for acid, and oh my, yes, it was quite tart. I believe this is also called sheep sorrel, aka Rumex acetosella. Mr. Talia told me people had offered him money for the hand-hewn stones from the old foundation, but he told me he would not sell them. He wanted to keep them for posterity, and I thanked him for that. He then showed me a stone wall. I think that was an original wall from days gone by, but I can't be certain that the stones were not restacked to make a foundation for the modern house that sits above. I was also told that the large hand-carved wooden bed in Konsmo Museum came from that house. I was unable to visit the museum when I was there. Actually, I did not even know about it until it was too late. I guess I'll just have to go back. After the overly brief tour of Solberg, we went back down to Ode's farm. Again, downhill from Solberg, Sun Mountain. He showed me some photos online of two women. The lifespan of both of those women overlaps the lifespan of my great-great-grandmother, and being that names are passed down through the generations of Norwegian families, I highly suspect that they're related. I don't know how yet, but the information is there, specifically at a little church, not in Konsmo, but a place called Bjelland, Bell, B-J-E-L-L, Land, Bell, Land, or Bjelland. The small town northeast of Konsmo, and they also have a little church, and the church also has records, which are also now online. And these records told me the names of Guri's parents, Lars Knudsen and Tona Riersdatter, meaning there was a Nud and a Riers in the generation before that, and maybe a Lars and a Grandma Tony 2 generations prior. Actually, all that was true, and I had already had the documentation. A friend I had met online by the name of Nanette had already told me all this and more. But such is the nature of genealogy. One gets buried in information, and the mind cannot remember all things. Ode also showed us the old schoolhouse on his property. Get out an old skeleton key to open it up for us. He said this one was built in 1910. I think he said that. And that it was the second one on that spot. And before that, he said the school was held on the upper floor of his now 200-plus-year-old farmhouse. I cannot help but to think that Guri Larsdatter, from the adjoining farm at Solberg, learned how to read in his attic. Guri married Torkel in 1856 and moved to Konsmo. Children came along in close succession, first a Lars in 1857, then an Ingeborg in 1860, then Thorkild in 1862, then another Thorkel in 1865, then Thomin in 1868, then another Lars in 1870, and Thorine in 1873, who died in 1873, the same year her father died. But wait, what happened? Why is it more than one Lars and more than one Torkel? Well, in Norway, the old tradition was to name the first son after the paternal grandfather and the second son after the maternal grandfather. Same for the girls, but they were named after the grandmothers. But when a child died, it often happened that the next son or daughter would be given the same name. This is what happened here. And being that Lars was the oldest son I found, I suspect there was probably another Torkel before him, because Torkel should have been the oldest son. Except there are two Larses, and they're both alive at the same time, and they're both reported later, and I'm not sure what the answer to that is. The naming convention makes it easy to trace family lines, but this means you could get a bunch of cousins with identical names. In our family, the name Torkel, Lars, and Ingeborg pops up multiple times amongst the family members. In fact, my great-grandfather's father, also Torkel, had two brothers. Had more brothers also, but two of the brothers are recorded as having children. So there was a Torkel Torkelson, a Torkel Larsson, and a Torkel Olsson, all cousins in the same generation in the same town. It's no wonder why people often add to the name of the farm where they live. Yeah, that Torkel from this farm, not that Torkel from the other farm, just to help keep everybody straight. In the 1865 census, Guri is living with Torkild, age 34, blacksmith, and Lars, age 9, Torkild, my great-grandfather, age 1, and Ingeborg, age 6. But in the 1875 census, Torkel Torkelson is not present. He had died in 1873. Guri is listed as being on partial poor support, and she has with her Lars, age 18, who's working part-time, Ingeborg, age 15, who's helping her mother, and 3 children that are listed as in care of the mother, Torkild, age 10, Tomine, age 7, and the second Lars, now age 5. In 1891, 1900, and 1920 census, Guri was living in Konsmo with her daughter Tomine, and she died at the ripe old age of 91 on the 4th of April 1929. Torkel and his brother Lars left for the U.S. and arrived in the port of New York. Torkel and Lars would not have gone through Ellis Island, however. That would not start up until 1892. Instead, they would have come through probably Fort Clinton at what is now Battery Park in Lower Manhattan. Lars found work as a deep-sea diver for Merritt Chapman and Company, and ended up living in the Norwegian Sailors' Home, which I believe was a missions outreach of the Norwegian Sailors' Church. And one of those churches still exists in Manhattan, believe it or not. I know little about Torkel's life in New York City. I do know that his life took a new turn when in 1895 he married a petite Irish woman named Lizzie Gorman. She was born in Dublin, Ireland. Her parents had somehow survived the Great Hunger that had killed millions of Irish people in the 1840s. And the family came to America like so many other millions of Irish people looking for a better life. And Lizzie Gorman found herself living in the same apartment building as Torkel Torkelson at 411 81st Street in the Yorkville neighborhood of Upper East Side Manhattan. And they probably met there. Interestingly, it was a stone's throw from Gracie Mansion where the mayor now lives. Torkel and Lizzie got married in 1895 at the house at 71 East 82nd Street in the city of New York by the Protestant Episcopal Church. On that location today is now a giant church of Scientology. I don't know what happened to the original building. In seeking better opportunities, Lizzie and Torkel moved to Jekyll Island in Georgia, where Torkel became the head carpenter for the Jekyll Island Club. Jekyll Island was an enclave of the richest of the rich, the winter playground for the titans of industry and their financiers. I have several original photos of my family on the island, and there are more photos in the Jekyll Island Club book, on several websites, and from the Jekyll Island Museum archives. In one photograph from that book, there's an aerial shot of the staff gardens and the house my family lived in. You see the white posts on the fence that surround the garden? Those are the same white posts in this photo of my grandfather and his brothers, but shot from the other direction. The original photo in the book was shot from atop the old water tower. According to the website JekyllIsland.com, in an article titled Lost Jekyll, my great-grandfather, Torkel, built 2 of the early landmarks on that island. That's the windmill and the water tower. And since the article discusses my great-grandfather and his handiwork, I'm going to quote the article at length. Quote, "If you look at vantage points of the Jekyll Island Club, you may notice a windmill and a water tower looming over the compound. A singular sight, taller even than the main buildings. In 1891, the club opted to erect the tower and windmill, a low-tech water pump, to replace leaky water tanks in the club attic. The structures were ordered from A.J. Corcoran in New York, transported to Brunswick by rail, then ferried to the island. The man charged with the assembly was one Torkel Chips Torkelson, a Norway native who worked as a ship's carpenter and was called on for many Jekyll building projects. The structures rose behind the clubhouse annex to the east. By all accounts, they did the job until they got clobbered by weather. In 1896, club superintendent Ernest Grob wrote Corcoran that his products performed beautifully, except during cyclones. Then came the 1898 Georgia hurricane, the strongest storm in state history. After that debacle, which flooded the streets of Brunswick, that's the closest town on the mainland, and wrecked newly built Chakotay Cottage, Grob dashed off another letter to Corcoran. The windmill had been decimated and he needed a new one. As best as can be determined, the second tower and windmill lasted for the next 3 decades. Then came the tempest of 1928. Apparently, they lost a lot of the beach, and oak trees came down and the windmill was damaged, Mayor Quinn says. At that point, Torkelson's handiwork was awash. The structures were dismantled by the next year. Wow, until recently, I did not know any of that. The Jekyll Island Club book also says that Torkel built the launch that was used to ferry people back and forth to the mainland. There was a schoolhouse on the island for the children of the white employees. It closed in the 1910s due to lack of students. Well, they lost 5 students when my family left in 1912. I wonder if that was the last straw. In the spring of 1899, just a few months after the end of the Spanish-American War, President William McKinley visited the island with his wife, Ida Saxton McKinley. McKinley had narrowly won the election against the populist firebrand William Jennings Bryan, later the star of the 1925 Scopes monkey trial. I've written about him on creation.com, and I made a video about him on biblicalgenetics.com. But also present were Vice President Garrett Hobart and Second Lady Jenny Tuttle Hobart. The Vice President would die that November. McKinley would be assassinated in 1901, right after his second inauguration. Jekyll Island was also infamous. It is the birthplace of the creature from Jekyll Island, also known as the Federal Reserve. In January of 1910, a group of bankers representing 1/4 of the world's wealth left Hoboken, New Jersey in a blacked-out train car using pseudonyms to travel south for a 1-week stay at the Jekyll Island Club, where they were tasked with devising a scientific system of banking for the United States. The resulting Federal Reserve Act was signed by President Woodrow Wilson on December 23, 1913, and my family was there for that infamous meeting as well. There are other interesting anecdotes about Norwegians in the Glynn County, Brunswick area. I am told that at Ellis Island there is, or at least was, a wall upon which all the ports of embarkation in the United States are listed. So of course there's New York and Philadelphia, where my Carter ancestors came from, and all the others also. And Brunswick, Georgia is there. But the number of people that came through the port of Brunswick was exactly 1. In fact, the story goes that they needed a new lighthouse keeper for the St. Simon's Island Lighthouse, which is just north of Jekyll Island. So they found a man in Norway, brought him straight to St. Simon's Island, anchored the ship offshore, rowed him ashore in a lifeboat, and then the immigration service came to him. Why is there another Norwegian here in Brunswick, Georgia? What a strange place for a Norwegian. Most Norwegians did not immigrate to southeast Georgia. But in the Jekyll Island Club book, I also learned that Torkel's replacement was a Norwegian man named Chris Nielsen. And there are other Torkelsons in Brunswick today, and they're buried there in the past. I mean, there's Torkelsons in Brunswick. Who are these people? Why are these Norwegians appearing there? I would love to figure out how these people connect. Edwin Gould, 1866 to 1933, was a railroad tycoon. He owned a home at the Jekyll Island Club and apparently became a friend of my family. My grandfather's middle name was Edwin, after him. Gould lived in the Chakota estate. It had a swimming pool, a playhouse, indoor tennis courts, a rifle range, a bowling alley. Today, there's almost nothing left at Chakota. Edwin Gould, Jr. died in a hunting accident on Jekyll Island in 1917, age 23. Apparently, he was attempting to club a raccoon he had trapped with the butt end of a loaded shotgun. And that did not end well. It might be that his namesake has only been carried in my own family, because we now have 3 generations of Edwins. And yet, even though my family were rubbing elbows with some of the world's richest people, life on Jekyll Island was not without its hardships. I have a photo of the boys, each holding what looks like a brand new bicycle, but I also found a newspaper ad taken out by my great-grandfather advertising several bikes for sale. Apparently the boys didn't get to keep those beautiful bicycles. On one trip to the area, I stopped at St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Brunswick on the offhand chance that they had some old records. They did! I found records of births, baptisms, and deaths. Surprisingly, I learned of 2 great aunts that I never knew existed. They were both named Jenny, and neither survived long enough to be counted in a U.S. Census. I believe one of them is a child in the perambulator in this family photo. My grandfather is the boy standing next to his mother. I also have a small prayer book in my possession. It's a daily devotional inscribed, Til Torkel Torkelson fra din moder, julaften 1910. That is, to Torkel Torkelson from his mother, Christmas Eve, 1910. Torkel Chips Torkelson, the head carpenter for the Jekyll Island Club, was dying of tuberculosis. I can only imagine that he had written her a letter to tell her the bad news, and she in turn had sent him something in way of consolation, a small thing from the home country that would also help him focus his thoughts on God as he was preparing to meet him. Yes, Torkel died March 14th, 1912, on Jekyll Island, leaving his beautiful bride with 5 young sons. Lizzie would take the kids back to New York City, leaving behind the graves of her husband and 2 infant daughters named Jenny. But not many years later, she'd also lose 2 of those sons, Ernest and Norman, to tuberculosis, like their father. They spent time in a sanatorium in Saranac Lake, New York, but were eventually sent home to die among family. And tuberculosis was a scourge of modern society. In my article that reviewed the book Hunter's Civic Biology, which was a textbook at the center of the 1925 Scopes monkey debate, I included a picture from that book that's a map of a certain area of New York City that has dots where every time a person with tuberculosis was found. And it's like every single building has dots. My father had gotten tuberculosis in the 1950s, happily, after the invention of antibiotics, but that kept him out of Vietnam, also happily. My great-uncle Frank had gotten tuberculosis. He fought in the Battle of the Bulge in World War II. When he came home, well, happily again, antibiotics, so he lived many more years. I got to meet him. But death was an all-too-common visitor at those times. And even though the record of St. Mark's Episcopal Church says he was buried in Palmetto Cemetery, and even though my grandmother's diary says she visited the gravesite in 1929, there's no record of him at that cemetery. To this day, no one knows where Torkel Torkelson or the 2 Jennies were buried. My grandfather, Torkel Edwin, owned a radio shop in Brooklyn. That's where he met my grandmother, Winnie, who would often be found at the corset shop next door, which is owned by my recently widowed great-grandmother, also named Winnie, who was born in Frisia in the northern Netherlands. Well, Grandma Winnie was 17 when they got engaged, but her mother made them wait until she was 18. Then the newlyweds delayed their honeymoon for a year before they drove, yes, drove, in 1927 from New York City to Brunswick, Georgia, mother-in-law in tow. It would be Lizzie's last trip to Jekyll. At one point, my grandmother wrote that they had driven for 13 hours and covered only 300 miles through the coastal swamps of Carolina, not seeing a soul almost the entire day. What were the coastal Carolinas like in 1927? Wow. No main roads, probably dirt highways, ferries instead of bridges, etc. They had to take a launch to Jekyll Island because there was no bridge yet. I wonder if that was the same launch that Torkel Chips Torkelson had made. They met Captain Clark and Mr. Grob, in whose cabin they stayed. They watched sea turtles laying eggs on the beach at night and explored, as my grandmother's diary records, every nook and cranny on the island. After returning to the mainland, they stayed with the Cowman family and visited Torkel's grave in Brunswick, which is now lost. One of my uncles told me that Torkel came away from there angry because he had just learned that Lizzie was not his father's first wife. One of my cousins recently confirmed that from the New York City marriage record, where he's listed as a widower. But who was the first wife? What kind of life did Torkel lead before he met Lizzie, 9 years his junior, whom he married when she was but a lass of 18? And what convinced her to marry this man with a funny accent and the funny name, and then allow him to take her to the deep, deep South? The family has since scattered to the winds, living in Florida, New York, California, the Midwest, South Carolina. They're descendants of Torkel Torkelson everywhere. Retracing Torkel's journey has been a profound experience. He had no idea what would become of his progeny, but this great-grandson of his is now an author, a video producer, popular public speaker. Even though I've chosen to take a path less traveled, I must stop and wonder, would he be proud of me? What about the rest of his scores of descendants? How are we doing? Are we carrying on his legacy? Special thanks to the Jekyll Island Museum Archives, JekyllIsland.com, the Cosmo Historical Society, and Jekyll Island Club in general for their invaluable information. Back in Norway, Ugir and his lovely family were wonderfully helpful, especially driving me around. But special thanks goes to Mr. Ode and Mr. Talia for an afternoon that I will never forget, as I was against all odds given a surprising glimpse into the life of Guri Larsdatter. Also thanks to my family members who have helped along the way and were interested in our common family genealogy, specifically my cousins Debbie and Jim from different families, but all three of us have been working on this for a long time. It's been a lot of work and a lot of rewards along the way. You two have been great for encouraging me. But I also want to stop and thank my mom for starting me off on this. It was 1988. I had come home for Christmas break after finishing my first course in genetics, and I started asking her questions about genetics and family history, and unbeknownst to me, she was about to bring out the box. The box with all the family information, the old Bibles, the old birth records, the marriage certificates. I had no idea that this existed, and that just opened up a brand new world to me. A world that I've now been immersed in for 30 years.